Hi, I'm Amy, and welcome to my channel. Here we discuss spirituality and psychology around relationships. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about boundaries. And if it is that you are anxious, attached, or fearful avoidant, the concept of boundaries can be quite terrifying, and it definitely was for me. I didn't know I could have boundaries, what my boundaries were. I was frightened of setting a boundary because then, someone would abandon me, or I would be disliked, or I would rock the boat in some way. Now, having done quite a lot of work on this, I can see now how essential boundaries are and how it is that boundaries even work. Now, if it is that you grew up in childhood not being able to have boundaries, or even if you did set a boundary, that you were punished for your boundaries, for example, which I absolutely was. My opinion couldn't have been different to my parents. The way I behaved had to be a certain way. I wasn't allowed to have my own beliefs. And I had a lot of enmeshment trauma in my childhood, which meant that I wasn't in a position to really disagree with what my parents were saying, which, brought up a load of people pleasing, agreeableness, which in my relationships in later life were really destructive. And because I didn't have a solid sense of self, I didn't have boundaries that protected my sense of self. What I did was I would glean my sense of self from the person that I was with. And what that looked like was that I would agree with everything that they said. I would never ever tell them what my boundaries were. I would allow them to overstep these invisible boundaries that I had and get really mad about it. I wouldn't discuss what my needs in a relationship were. And I continued that enmeshment trauma in my adult relationships. But essentially, what happened is that I became very anxious. I was hyper aware. I was afraid of upsetting anyone because I was worried about what the outcome of that would be. So, I'm going to do a drawing exercise which will help you understand what happens when, as a child, your boundaries are overstepped. So, I want you to imagine that you are a cell. That is a really terrible circle, I am sorry. But this is you, and you are a cell. This is your membrane, and this is containing all of your sense of self in here. Now, every time in childhood a boundary is overstepped, so let's say that you had an argument with your parents and someone said, you shouldn't feel that way, go to your room, you're not accepted if you're angry. This makes a gap in the membrane. And when this gap is made, what you essentially do is all your goodness comes out. There is a leak. There's a breach in the wall of the cell. But also, all of the crap is allowed in. And that crap becomes this sense of self. So when you were younger, and let's say you had abusive parents or you grew up in a really chaotic household, the cell walls are continually breached until there are no cell walls at all. So you eventually have no boundaries and therefore no sense of self. And if you're anything like me, I sort of got into adulthood not really knowing who I was and not really knowing what my needs were, what my boundaries were, and certainly not in a position where I could actually assert a boundary. So what I had to do was actually learn who I was from the ground up, because nothing was authentic. Everything that I thought was me had been conditioned into me by somebody else. And I would be attracted to people who seemed confident because I thought, well, if they're confident, then they have a really good sense of self. They really know who they are. So I'm just going to attach myself to that person in the hope that somehow by osmosis, that would transfer to me and I would know who I was. But I had to learn this all on my own from the ground up. And this is something that is continual. This is something that's not going to be done overnight. So I want you to be really patient with yourself, because if you've grown up in an enmeshed household, it's going to be a difficult task to not look at the outside for approval and validation, and actually be able to approve and validate yourself and trust what you're saying. If you've grown up in a household, for example, where there was a lot of gaslighting, you will start to do this to yourself because you will internalize that. So any opinion that you have, you will start to second guess. And for me, when I was really aware that that was happening, it was almost like a torture. It was like I was in a prison in my mind where I didn't trust what my opinion was, what my beliefs were. I always needed somebody else to say either yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong. So if that is you, no judgment at all. And the reason why I've made this video is because I want you to have a sense of self. I want you to feel confident and secure in exactly who you are. I want you to be able to accept those parts of you that you don't like. I want you to be able to accept all parts of you, because that is where your true sense of self is. And if you can see underneath the trauma, this is where your sense of self is. It is still there. It needs building on, it needs nurturing, but it is there. So I hope you found that video helpful. If you did, drop a comment below. If you need further help, you can email me, and the link is in my bio, and I will see you in the next video.